Yeah, I'm John Clarke and I'm an organiser with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I was due to go to Montreal this week to make a presentation on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project, but I got sick, so not wanting to waste the preparations that I'd done to make the presentation, I'm just going to put this up on social media. So the idea that I want to put across is that there is a developing model of neoliberal basic income that's being developed internationally, and that the Ontario pilot project fits very much within that mould. For several decades, there has been an agenda of neoliberal austerity. And one of the key aspects of this, in terms of seeking to increase the rate of exploitation, has been to degrade income support programs so as to try to engender a climate of desperation so that people will scramble for the lowest paying jobs. And as we all know, it's been enormously successful. There's been an explosion of low wage precarious work. Now the programs that they have used in order to drive people into this low wage sector has very much been those that descended from the 1834 New Poor Laws in England, the system of inadequate income delivered under terms that are calculatedly degrading and judgmental and punitive. I'm going to suggest that at this point in time, the architects of the neoliberal agenda, the institutions of global capitalism and many governments are starting to, although by no means has a consensus been arrived at yet, but are starting to think in terms of a different approach. And I believe that the concept of basic income is more than just a PR turn. I think that the idea has real possibilities for furthering and intensifying the neoliberal agenda. Now, the elements of a neoliberal model of basic income would have at least these defining features. First of all, they would likely be means tested. They would not literally be a universal basic income. They would be given to the poorest people. And the level of payment would be set low enough not to impede the scramble for the lowest paying jobs on offer. In other words, an amount that people would not be able to live at all well on if that's all they received. In giving this money to people who are low wage workers, what is really happening is that a wage subsidy is being paid to low paying employers, which undercuts and undermines the capacity to struggle for decent wages and takes pressure off the governments in terms of raising minimum wages. The second element of the thing that I think is really important is reduced conditionality. It's not going to be a universal payment given without restriction, but much of the kind of bureaucratic intrusion and calculated degradation and moral policing that has been part of the system up until now is not needed as much, precisely because it's worked so well. They have been so successful in creating vulnerable workers with few rights who must scramble from job to job trying to survive, that they simply don't need to hammer people as much as they have been doing. They can ease up on that. And in fact, it becomes counterproductive to render people destitute in periods between employment. So I think the concession of reducing conditionality is something that is likely the more enlightened people involved in developing the neoliberal agenda begin to, I think, appreciate and understand that. The other key and defining feature of a neoliberal basic income, and this has been advanced by the US political scientist Charles Murray, the very right-wing figure, the payment must not augment other systems of social provision, it must replace them, so that people with their basic payment become shoppers in the neoliberal marketplace, rummaging through the rubble of the social infrastructure as customers. So if we look at the Ontario pilot, those features, I think, are all there to be seen. Some 4,000 people in three areas of the province are to receive for 3 years a basic payment if they manage to recruit enough people, which they're not doing at this point. The payment is certainly going to be a sub-poverty payment. It's set at around 75% of the low-income measure, a significant increase actually on the deplorably low money that people on social assistance get. But it's not going to primarily people on social assistance. Some 70% of the people who are going to be participating in their pilot, if they pull it off, will be people outside of social assistance, primarily low-wage workers. So what they are testing is precisely the impact of this subsidy to employers. It will be, although not by no means unconditional, it will be less conditional than the present social assistance regime, and some of the intrusions will unquestionably be removed, but people will be expected to, as they put it, self-navigate. So many of the referrals and supports that people would have been able to obtain on social assistance will no longer be there, and most tellingly of all, people will lose if they transfer over to the pilot from social assistance. They will lose the protection they had against debt collectors, so that people will have their basic income taken by court order away from them. And I think this is more than just a design flaw. It is in line with the model of the unprotected customer shopping in the marketplace that the basic income is so based on. And when it comes to replacing rather than augmenting existing systems of social provision, and remember this is a small-scale showpiece project in which they can afford to be relatively generous, the writing is already on the wall. People on social assistance who go on the pilot will lose access to their special diet benefits. They will lose access to medical transportation, which for people in Northern Ontario having to go by plane is an enormous question. They will lose access to mobility devices. They will be on their own in that regard. So there will be a whole population of disabled people on Ontario Disability Support Programme who will not want to go onto the programme because they will be worse off. And when the basic income pilot is evaluated, that very important and significant section of disabled people with high support needs will be in effect disregarded. So I think that based on those observations, the case that the Ontario pilot is, as some advocates of basic income suggest, a flawed but important first step just doesn't hold water. What is being experimented here in Ontario, as in Finland, is a model that furthers rather than compensates for or reduces the impact of the neoliberal agenda. Now, there are those, of course, advocates of progressive basic income who will argue that this may be true, but the model that they are advancing is one of a universal, adequate payment that will not replace existing systems of social provision, but that will build upon them. That's all very nice, but frankly, you can demand that the sky rain whiskey. The real issue is what is likely and what is possible. We have gone through several decades of neoliberal attack. Trade unions are weaker than they have been. Political parties that once, even in a limited way, advanced progress have been compromised and driven back. Social movements do not have the critical mass that would make an effective advance against neoliberalism possible. We are fighting, whether we like to admit it or not, a largely defensive struggle at this point in time. So to suggest that you can take a neoliberal model of basic income and compel them to make it progressive and redistributive or transformative doesn't seem very likely in the present neoliberal context. But I would even say that kind of a universal adequate payment That created a situation where people received enough to live on decently before they considered the question of what relationship they would have with the job market is more than a social reform. It would in fact remove the economic coercion on which the whole capitalist job market rests. It would be more than a concession. It would be like creating an unlimited strike fund for the working class. And the capitalist class is not going to accept that, and the capitalist state is not going to implement it. But what is being prepared is this neoliberal model of basic income. It's emerging in various places, and it is certainly emerging here in Ontario. There isn't a social policy end run around the realities of the neoliberal agenda. And what I'm afraid is happening when people in Ontario and other places hope against hope that they can create, that they can undermine the neoliberal agenda through this social policy initiative. What in practice is happening, I'm afraid, is that they are laying down a welcome mat for a neoliberal attack. And that will prove to be a profound mistake.